part 2. We get into Impressionism. Now, Manet breaks ground here. He's our first Impressionist. And the piece that we're going to look at is not as indicative of the style as it moves forward, but it starts a wave of change. Okay, so we were looking at realism, which Manet and the other Impressionists highly regard and admire. And of course, we're in the Salon of 1850 here. And then when 1863 rolls around and people are starting to do some different sort of styles and movements and sort of individually break free of the historical painting. Remember, that's the hierarchy, and still life and portraiture and the Bible and so on. And they're starting to do things from the everyday, and that becomes controversial. So 3,000 submitted works were rejected in 1863 because the Academy, with its salon, remember the salon is the show, the exhibition, they refused all these works, and so they started a second salon, the group of people that were rejected, called the Salon des Refusés. Now, would include Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, and this is the touchstone. This is the big shift here, 1863. Oh my goodness, a bunch of things happening here, where he is actually emulating or imitating Titian's Fête Champêtre and Raphael's The Judgment of Paris, some other works that there's a little inset in page 475 for the composition and also the style. But what he's trying to say is that everyday people can be shown, like Courbet's painting, gritty and realistic. We'll back up into here. You can kind of see the connection a bit with the facial definition and so on. So these guys are in realistic 19th century clothing, but then we have a nude female here and a woman bathing here, and sort of recalling Renaissance traditions. So what the Academy thought that Manet was making fun of Titian and Raphael and making fun of the Academy because you're supposed to do something historical or biblical or something like that, and he's doing neither here, and they feel like he's making fun of them. Also, we get some distortion, which gets into the Impressionists, and this is not where Impressionist is coined. We're not there yet from this painting, but this is sort of our bridge to Impressionism. But see how some areas are getting less defined? You're noticing some of these areas that don't have full hyperrealism like we saw with realism. Hyperrealism is something else, but details, I should say. And then she is out of proportion, and the boat. So she and the boat are almost in the same place. So she is massive compared to this boat. So he's playing around. He's not obeying the rules of perspective. He's messing about. Okay. So, but what Impressionism gets into is that it's aimed to capture an impression, and they're not trying to portray anything literal, but the sensation of something. Now, we love Impressionism. Everybody loves it, and I'll explain to you why. It's kind of a trick, actually. But when we did talk about optical mixing, and we'll get into that a little bit more, but the idea that they could go outdoors with these tubes of oil paint, they're not, like we looked at William Turner in the video. Oh, you didn't watch this one. Okay, so the crushing video, the crushing of the oil and the pigment, you'd have to mix your own paints, basically, and it wasn't portable. So now we have oil in tubes, and we can just squeeze it out onto our palette, and so we can go outdoors, and we can start to look at scenery and look at, capture the time of day with the light. So many of these artists, mainly Monet, capture the same image over and over and over, like the church or a pond or whatever, different times of day, different times of the year, trying to capture the transitory nature of light, if that makes sense, the time of day. Okay, so this is our piece from Monet here. Remember, this is Manet. Don't get confused. Edouard Manet. I know, it's really confusing. Why do two people with such similar names have to be in the same movement, right? So Claude Monet is got this painting with these sort of like chunks of brushstrokes, just different paint colors mixing it on here. But we're not going like let's blend these colors together. What we're doing is doing a splotch of orange, a splotch of pink, a splotch of perhaps like a yellow, and then what you're doing in your brain is you're mixing all these colors together and making it make sense to you. So we're doing an impression of the time of day. See how there's a little bit of pink in the clouds, maybe a sort of a late in the day or early in the day piece, and we're just getting a few details here. Now, I'm going to back up and say that the first painting, called Impressionistic, was a Monet, not a Manet, and it was called Impression Sunrise. So that is what a critic, Jules Antoine Castagnary, I'm not exactly sure how to say it, how to pronounce his name, but he was a critic, and he called it that they're not aiming for perfection, but to capture an impression, because that piece was called Impressionism. And his quote from page 476 is, "I swear there's talent here, and a lot of it. These young people have a way of understanding nature that is neither dull nor banal. It's lively, nimble, light, ravishing. It's admittedly sketchy, but how much of it rings true?" So he put on the title, the headline of his piece, The Impressionist. So that sort of stuck, and that's how the name was involved. But it's true. They are trying to take a quick glimpse at something. Now, a couple things to note. 1873 photography has come into play. We have had the photograph around for a little bit. So two things happen. One is that the Impressionists are no longer bound to paint a realistic portrait of someone or an event or anything, because photography is going to do that now. Now they can play around with paint and color and make these sort of blurry images. So that frees them up to just sort of do some other things, and you'll see that's where we get into a more and more abstract ways of painting, because photography has got reality covered, if that makes sense, in terms of depiction. The other part with photography, what influences the Impressionists, is that momentary capturing of light. They start to think about that and contemplate that, because a photograph captures a moment kind of quickly. So those are important things in Impressionism. There's many other things to say about it, but generally speaking, we're out of doors, not always, but we're out of doors and we're depicting a natural scene. Different compositions are starting to evolve. Monet personally loves water, and so he does a lot of these sort of watery paintings. Renoir, very different look to the work, but also an impressionist, just as much so as Monet. Renoir has a long life and lives into the 20th century, and his son or grandson, I can't remember, becomes a film director of some note in France. So you see how there's kind of these patchy shadows. They're not hard definitions. Everything is kind of soft. And then we have light coming through the trees and dappled sunlight on these people. You can see it a little bit on his coat. That's sort of the best spot to sort of see it on this gentleman's hat. But we are portraying right here the middle class, which now exists in the mid 19th century. People are free to go out. This is a beer garden out of doors, and they're dancing and drinking beer and so on and carrying on in the afternoon and enjoying themselves in great numbers. And we are not high class here. We are working people that have some free time, and we get to enjoy one another. So this is unusual depiction of this particular grouping of people, but it's also unusual to the time frame that these group of people are having free time. Okay, Berthe Morisot, one of our early Impressionist painters. And this is again, water. We like water. We have outdoors, and we have the people enjoying a leisure activity. What else do I want to say about this? Okay, so she was born to a well-to-do family. This is from page 478, and she received private art lessons. So she became an amateur painter, and her husband took precedence, but her talent sort of kind of came to the foreground later. So this is open air or plein air painting. She's out of doors. Same thing as we were talking about with those tubes. You're able to go out of doors. But she was one of the few women that had any kind of notoriety for painting at this time. Okay, really beautiful brushstrokes in here, sort of unfinished at the bottom here, but that's also part of the beauty of the painting. The reason that we react so strongly is the same thing as I was saying about Monet. You're mixing the colors in your brain, so you're finishing this painting. Both in these unfinished areas, your brain is deciding to take all of this down, and you decide to make this look like this in your mind. So that's part of it, but also that you're mixing these colors and shadows, these blobs of color everywhere. You're making it make sense in your own brain, because the artist isn't giving you all that detail and all that clarity and focus. You're having to do it in your head, and that is where this is a really interactive piece. So no artists before this are really asking you to do any effort in terms of determining what you're looking at, and we get in more and more into that with abstraction, as we're going to see. But the Impressionists, ever popular because you play an active role in seeing these colors and these shapes and so on in your own brain. Okay, Post-Impressionist. Little fuzzy here on this. There's some overlap. And some of our characters, like Degas, is an Impressionist and a Post-Impressionist. Cezanne, Gauguin, Seurat. Seurat has his own designation. He's a pointillist. So the pointillist technique, he's kind of a subset of Impressionist, but we're calling him a Post-Impressionist. It's kind of both. So he develops these dots and dashes. We're going to look at him first. And this is from chapter 4, yeah? And it has a bunch of little tiny specks. Again, we're figuring out what this purple color, which actually has orange, and it actually has a bunch of other colors in there. We're figuring this out in our brain. Same thing with our beige sandy beach. There's no beige in there at all. There's a bunch of complementary colors. There's some darker shadows, but we're making up all the lines in this piece in our mind. Look at this on the frame. That just blows my mind. He goes so far as to do the pointillist technique on the frame to give you a sense that it's an extension of the painting. Absolutely wild. Try this if you like. Every time I've moved to a different school, I see somebody in the painting department for a semester attempt pointillism. But man, you got to have some serious OCD to finish something like this, and they generally decide that's not for them. So Gauguin is another one, and Cezanne is another one we're going to get into. Gauguin decides to just bail on Europe. He's French. He goes all the way to Tahiti. He wants to get away from the industrialized world. So a lot of reactions there are happening. Cezanne, he starts to get into structure and order, and he is the groundwork. He's the bridge from the Impressionists to Cubism and an influence for Picasso, which we're going to see. Okay, so Gauguin, here we are in Tahiti. He's left the country. He's decided that the industrial world is not for him. It's too stressful. He does some other paintings, local, and of course he and Van Gogh are in France together and have their falling out, and Van Gogh slices his ear off. But that's before all of this. He goes out to Tahiti. He loves all the colors. But he decides he's not going to replicate what he sees exactly. He's going to interpret things in whatever way he wishes and use all this wilder coloration, like these yellow palm trees. And of course, he wants to get back to nature. And in his mind, the culture in Tahiti, with its scantily clothed, men and women, he wants to get back to people who are more connected to the land. One disappointment, though, because he's in 1892 here, Tahiti has already really been colonized. The French have been there for a very long time, and he has this idealistic notion that he's going to make this big discovery of this undisturbed population, which doesn't turn out to be true. And he also contracts syphilis at some point. The French ships have been through Tahiti and given syphilis to the native population, and thereby they give it to Gauguin, and he dies. But it's interesting because this is a port, it's an island in the middle of the Pacific on the way to other islands. So there's a lot of trade and traffic there. So he kind of defeats the purpose, but he does enjoy himself. He does do a number of these paintings in these beautiful colors. Flattened color, not really that blurry impressionism, but a very different stylistic, way of working. Oh my goodness, Cezanne. Stunning piece, absolutely gorgeous. This one is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And remember, that's our first American museum on our shores. And this is a precursor to Cubism. You can really see why. So he's trying to get some abstraction going on and some geometric shapes or organic shapes as well at times. But he's trying to really he's breaking everything down into basic shapes in 1902 here. He paints this mountain several times. There's so many versions of this painting. But he's trying to break everything down in shapes and sort of simplify things. And you can really see the evolution in Cezanne's work because it starts more toward realism and it ends toward much more of a highly abstracted state.